In our last chapter, we saw my game against Wool almost complete, and aiming for the maximum variety. Now I will show you a game which I played against Van Velde, and we will begin already deep in the end game. And to understand the possible tactics in this position, as we did in the previous examples, first of all, we take a look at opponent's king on e6. Is he secure? What is white's options to disturb black's position? We see that also the rook on d7 could be vulnerable. Of course, all this could only be true if white brings his knight to c5, and that's basically how knight a4 becomes the most natural move. You see the threat, knight c5 check, and you start looking at knight a4. And after knight a4, you see that basically he should go somewhere, because your threat is knight c5 and it's pretty strong. And where can he go? He cannot go to e7 because g7 is hanging. He is not likely to go to d file because of rook d1 possibilities. So the most natural continuation for black is, as Van Velde played in this game, king f6. You attack with knight c5, and in your calculations, the most natural move to see is rook d4, because you do not expect your opponent to go into passivity, like rook d8 also, after which black would have a pretty solid position, although in my opinion white has some advantage. Now after rook d4, an interesting position arises. When we look at this position, first of all, we should know that we should find a certain tactical solution, because positionally we're not doing so great after all. Black has this mass of pawns on the king side, and once they start moving, especially given the fact that h4 is weak, they could become very dangerous. What speaks for white is the activity, or the possible activity, of his knight, a certain majority on the queen side, and some tactical patterns. And what are exactly these tactical patterns? Well, we see that in fact black's rooks are on d4 and f8, which means that they are actually in the range of a fork. That is, knight e6 under circumstances could maybe win some material. We see that king on f6 and rook on f8 are also basically bearing the same problem. That is, knight d7 could under circumstances win the exchange. And now you try to put all this together and you see how you can do this. That is, rook on d4 now controls the square d7. King on f6 controls the square e6. And now if you could disturb any of these pieces, if you could somehow distract black's coordination, then something would work. And that's basically how you come to the move knight f5. After knight f5, king takes f5. Now you see the possibility of rook f1 check, hitting the rook on f8. And this would work if it were not for rook f4. And thus, another bell rings in your mind, and you know that it is maybe possible to close the fourth rank. And this is possible with the win of time, with e4 check. And now miraculously all this goes together. If black goes to f4, then rook f1 just wins the rook on f8. If after e4 check black goes rook takes e4, then rook g5 check, and now I either pick up the rook on e4, or after king f4, knight e6 check finally works, and this rook, which was hanging in all the lines, finally falls. And the only other line to calculate is king f6. Van Velde also played in the game, And now rook f4 is no longer possible, so rook f1 check, as we saw in the previous line, king e7, rook takes f8, and now we see that after king f8, knight e6 check, we did everything we wanted to get all our tactics work. And it is important not just to make tactics work, but also to evaluate what happens at the end. Because if at the end of all our glorious tactical operation would be lost, this would be pretty unwise. Well, after king f7, knight takes d4, e takes d4, king d3, we see basically that we win the d4 pawn, and in the rising pawn endgame, white is pawn up. But it is not enough. We should check if after h5, king takes d4, g5, the h pawn gets to h1. And we see that after hg5, king g5, a4, that in fact white's king is in control. After h4 happens king e3, h3, king f3, and basically the h pawn is not going anywhere, whereas white's pawns are going to queen on the queen side. Basically all very simple. And if we return to the starting position, we see that it all started with us seeing that black king and black rook are basically on the squares which would enable a fork. And after this, there's very concrete play. Knight a4, rook d, king f6, knight c5, rook d4. We saw the forks again, and we just made them work. Basically, that's the way it goes. We see motives, we see positional aspects, we see tactical motives, we make them work, and calculate to see if they work. And that's basically it. That's the way it goes. And I hope you will be able to do this in the very soon future. And we proceed with our examples.